Goodwill Industries of Northern Illinois puts Freeport area workers into the shoes of someone re-entering society after getting out of jail. The goal is to help those who take part understand the challenges. These employees work with formerly incarcerated individuals in transportation, social work, court systems, or housing. Maya Foreman took part in the simulation. She played the role of a woman who spent 25 years in jail. Foreman called it a frustrating but enlightening experience.
This is something that could benefit both people within the realms of working to help people, or people that are going through the situation, or people who may even have things together but don't realize how hard it is for other people.